I had been in love with the girl for 10 years, and she finally said yes to my proposal. But the day before the wedding, I overheard her on the phone with someone else. "Henry, I'm pregnant with your child. If you show up tomorrow, I'll leave with you, okay?" The Henry she spoke of was her first love. The man she had longed for, but could never have. Anna and I are childhood friends. Since I was 16, when I first started to feel something for her, I had always been in love with her. A year ago, Anna Collins finally agreed to be with me, and just a month ago, she said yes to marrying me. The day before the wedding, the excitement and nervousness swirling in my chest kept me awake, restless. Despite Anna's request that we shouldn't meet the day before the wedding, saying it was bad luck, I couldn't resist. I had to see her. I quietly made my way to her house, and just as I was about to call her to let me in, I overheard voices from inside. A sliver of light peeked through the door, which wasn't fully shut. Anna's voice, tinged with an indistinct sob, reached my ears. "Henry, you finally picked up my call. I'm getting married tomorrow, but I still love you. I'm pregnant with your child. If you still love me, will you come to the wedding tomorrow? If you show up, I'll leave with you." I had known Anna for over 20 years, and I knew every expression on her face like the back of my hand. Even though I couldn't see her face now, I could picture her eyes brimming with tears, her brow furrowed slightly, her expression one of hurt and sadness. The kind of look I hated seeing most. It was the same look she wore when she was about to spend the rest of her life with me. I took a deep breath, forcing my body to stop trembling. Leaning against the cold wall, I fumbled to pull out a cigarette. Henry. He was Anna's high school classmate, her first love. Their love had been passionate and wild, the kind everyone knew about. But they were torn apart later, unable to survive the resistance and threats from Anna's parents. Throughout her 4 years of college, Anna never stopped thinking about Henry. I was more than willing to be there for her, comforting and staying by her side. Even if she didn't love me, I accepted it. So, when she asked me to be with her after graduation, I felt like I had become God's favorite. The moment I held Anna in my arms, it felt like I had the whole world. I loved her so deeply, I was willing to give her everything I had in my life. But the voices inside continued. Anna was still pouring out her feelings to Henry, the love and regret in her words so clear. I felt like a coward, sneaking around like a thief, eavesdropping on Anna's soft, unclaimed words. The smoke from the cigarette stung my nose, and I couldn't hold back a cough. "Who's out there?" By the time my brain processed what was happening, I had already stepped sideways into a nearby stairwell. Anna, holding her phone, came outside and looked around cautiously. My eyes greedily followed her face, still soft with baby fat, until her figure disappeared from view. That night, I sat downstairs from Anna's house until dawn. Cigarette butts piled up around me, one after another, while memories of all the years I spent with Anna played on a loop in my mind. Our families were close, and before Anna was even born, I was always circling around her mother, Mrs. Collins, and talking about how much I wanted a little sister. When Anna was born, she was wrinkled and tiny, but I never thought she was ugly. I even threatened the adults who said so. Back then, I always called myself Anna's older brother. Protecting her felt like my destiny. When I was 9 and she was 7, we attended the same elementary school. On the first day of class, a clueless boy picked on her. Anna stood silently, tears welling up in her eyes. When she saw me, she just looked at me, a silent plea in her gaze, and tugged at the corner of my shirt. "George." She didn't need to say more. The moment she called my name, I was ready to fight for her. That was the first time I fought for Anna, but it wouldn't be the last. As I got older, I began to realize that my feelings for Anna were more than just brother and sister feelings. I loved watching her, hearing her call my name, and admiring her beauty when she smiled. That feeling? That was love. Back then, Anna, too, always loved to follow me around, her eyes sparkling with admiration every time she looked at me. Until I turned 18 and Anna entered high school. That's when she fell for Henry. Henry was a thug, skipping class, smoking, fighting, he did it all. He took Anna on wild rides, showing her what he called the real feeling of being alive. The first time I saw Anna with her arms around his waist, sitting behind him on his motorcycle, I felt my heart drop straight into hell. After that, all she ever called me was George Morgan, her voice as cold as ice. She didn't need my protection anymore. In fact, she'd grow irritated with even my concern. She told me I was just trying to control her, that only Henry truly loved her. The Anna from those years felt like a stranger. Even when Anna and Henry were forced to separate, she was never the same again. She would snap at Mrs. Collins, and even threaten to end her life just to secure her love. When the last of my cigarette burned out, I stood up and looked toward Anna's window. It was pitch dark. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the chat history between Anna and me. Ever since we got together a year ago, I made sure to say good morning every day, update her on my plans, take her out for walks, buy her anything she wanted. But looking back, maybe she never cared. Otherwise, how could she always respond with such cold, dismissive tones? A month ago, Anna suddenly told me she wanted to travel with friends. I sent her $50,000, telling her to enjoy herself. She bought a flight to Manhattan. I didn't even think to remember that Henry was there. What was I thinking back then? I was imagining our engagement, planning our future, obsessively comparing apartments. Meanwhile, Anna was plotting how to leave me, to embrace her lover. I shifted my gaze from her window and walked toward my car alone. I realized the girl who once held my hand might have already disappeared long ago. All these years of clinging to Anna, of loving her, maybe it was just me chasing the ghost of who she used to be. If she wants to leave, then I choose to let her go. When I saw Anna again, she was wearing the wedding dress we had picked out together, pure and angelic. She was sitting there, gazing out the window. I knew exactly what she was waiting for. She was waiting for Henry. I told everyone to leave, giving them the excuse that I needed to talk to Anna alone. With the knowing smirks and teasing smiles on their faces, I could barely hold my own smile. Anna. She turned to look at me. She hid it well, but the flash of impatience in her eyes didn't escape me. Had she been enduring her frustration with me every day this past year? I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. I gave a self-deprecating smile, my gaze dropping to her stomach. Inside there was Henry's child. What's wrong, George? Maybe I'd been staring for too long, because Anna awkwardly covered her stomach. I already know. You're pregnant with Henry's child. Anna's face flashed with a brief moment of shock and discomfort, but she quickly composed herself. So, the cigarette ash outside the door last night, is it really yours? I nodded. She walked toward me, tears welling up in her eyes. If this had been before, any hint of sadness on Anna's face would have made me do everything I could to make her happy again. But now, even as she looked at me with those eyes, all I felt was irony. She had received so much love from me in this way, yet she had tossed it all aside. Perhaps it was my indifferent expression that made Anna feel awkward. She lowered her head, gently caressing her stomach. I'm sorry, George. I know you've been good to me, but, when it comes to feelings, there's nothing I can do. I can't let go of Henry. I love him. When she looked at me again, her gaze was filled with determination. As though I was the final boss standing in her way to true love, and once she defeated me, her life would be smooth sailing. I scoffed, my voice sharp. So, you're just realizing that feelings can't be helped now? Anna, if you still can't let go of Henry, why were you with me a year ago? Why did you accept my proposal a month ago? Was it not because you knew Henry's return was unlikely, so you kept your love for him, while also securing a backup plan for your life? Her face drained of color at my words. But I wasn't finished yet. Because I love you enough, you think I'll just bear all the pain you give me? Even if Henry never shows up, you'll marry me without a second thought, have his child, and make me raise him as my own? What do you take me for? What do you think my feelings for you are worth? I took a step closer to Anna, but she kept retreating until she ended up sitting down on a chair. She shook her head frantically, just like before, reaching out to grab my sleeve, but I easily dodged her. I've never been a soft-hearted person. Time and time again, I lowered my standards for Anna, simply because I loved her. It's not like that, George. Please, let me explain. I never meant to hurt you. I do love Henry, but I never wanted to hurt you. George, we grew up together. You know exactly what kind of person I am, don't you? She lifted her head, showing the delicate, fragile curve of her neck. She looked so innocent, so beautiful, like a girl who had never known pain. I stood still, unmoving. I don't know anymore, Anna. I don't recognize you anymore. With that, I turned my back on her, ignoring the fear and unease in her eyes, and walked toward the door. But just as I reached the door, I stopped. I didn't turn around. Anna, I have one request. No matter what, today's wedding must go off beautifully. What you choose to do with Henry is none of my concern. We can divorce tomorrow if you wish. But you absolutely cannot do anything to hurt my parents or yours at the wedding. If you do, I will make you regret it. We both knew how much our parents had been looking forward to this wedding. And with their age and health deteriorating, I didn't want any accidents that could harm their well-being. As I closed the door behind me, I heard Anna's voice softly respond, "I understand." But little did I know, I had underestimated the love between her and Henry. The wedding venue was just as I had imagined it, the setup exactly as I had once envisioned. But the woman I was marrying was no longer the girl I once loved. She stood at the far end of the aisle, slowly walking toward me under Mr. Collins' arm, each step a decade in the making. For 10 years, I never stopped loving her. But she couldn't bear my love. "George, I'm entrusting Anna to you." Mr. Collins' eyes shimmered with tears. In the end, I reluctantly took Anna's hand. Her hand was ice cold. Even when we stood beside the officiant, she kept stealing glances toward the door. Finally, as I was about to slip the ring onto her finger, the doors at the back of the hall were flung open. Everyone turned to look. There he was, Henry, the one Anna had always dreamed of. Dressed in a gray t-shirt, his hair slightly longer, covering his eyebrows, he had a lanky, almost gloomy air about him. But Anna didn't hesitate for a moment, she smiled radiantly, her face lighting up like a sunbeam. "Anna, I came as promised. What about you? Will you come with me?" He took a step forward, extending his hand to her. Anna's steps faltered immediately. I could feel it, and I reached out, grabbing her wrist. "Anna, don't forget what you promised me." I lowered my voice, afraid my parents seated in the audience would hear. But Anna didn't even hesitate. She pulled her hand free and, without a second thought, threw herself into Henry's arms. He embraced her and began walking toward the door. At that moment, Mr. Collins and the others finally reacted. Mrs. Collins stood up, shouting at Anna, "Anna! What are you doing? If you run away from this wedding today, we'll disown you." Henry's steps slowed, and Anna, still in his arms, finally cast a glance at her parents. But that look was as cold as ice. "Why can't you ever learn to respect me? Why can't you respect my feelings? I'm a living person, not a pet you keep caged." That was her last words to Mrs. Collins. No matter how many people tried to stop her, Anna never hesitated. I stood at the altar, the white suit on my body and the ring in my hand, feeling like a cruel joke. She had broken her promise. And with it, she had drained the last of my feelings for her. "What's wrong? Don't scare me." Mrs. Collins' voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I looked at Mr. Collins, only to see him clutching his chest, gasping for air, his face twisted in pain. I quickly rushed to him, steadying his body. I turned to Mrs. Collins, urgency in my voice. "Call an ambulance." Her eyes filled with tears, hands trembling. "George, we..." "Don't say it. Anna is Anna, and you are you. You've watched me grow up since I was a child. No matter what, you'll always be the elders I respect the most." Mrs. Collins nodded through her tears, dialing the phone. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, his cloudy eyes filled with approval. I knew that losing love was painful, but my life had to go on. I wasn't like Anna, who saw love as the ultimate pursuit of life. The doctor said that Mr. Collins had suffered from a sudden attack due to a surge of blood pressure and would need a long period of rest, with no further emotional strain. After settling him in, Mrs. Collins came out of the room to find me. Her eyes were red from crying, and despite wearing a beautiful gown, her exhaustion was evident. "George, Anna is sorry for you, don't worry, when she comes back, we will definitely teach her a lesson. She's a stubborn child, but at her core, she's still good. I still hope that you too." Mrs. Collins didn't finish, but I understood her meaning. She and Mr. Collins had always hoped that Anna and I would be together, not only because they had known my parents for many years, but also because they had seen how much I cared for Anna. But this time, I wasn't going to turn back. I gently took Mrs. Collins' hand and sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't continue being with Anna." Her expression was shocked, and she quickly asked, "Why? Is it because Anna ran away from the wedding?" "Don't worry, we'll make sure to teach her a lesson. This won't happen again." "She's pregnant. The child is Henry's." Mrs. Collins' eyes widened in shock, and she gasped for breath, stumbling back a few steps. Luckily, my mother was there to catch her. "George, apologize to Mrs. Collins." My father's voice came down with authority. I met Mrs. Collins' eyes, which were filled with a hint of hope. She was waiting for me to say it was all just a joke, an outburst due to my anger over Anna. But it was all true. I smiled bitterly. It's true. I only found out yesterday. Tears welled up in Mrs. Collins' eyes. We've wronged you, George. We didn't deserve you. She sobbed heavily, and my mother, concerned for her, decided to stay in the hospital with her. My father had to handle the aftermath of the wedding, so I was left to go home alone. As I reached the door, I saw Anna crouched on the ground. At the sound of my footsteps, she looked up at me. Her wedding dress had long been replaced, and she was now wearing clothes that seemed to belong to Henry. She looked even smaller and more delicate. When she saw me, Anna immediately stood up and walked toward me, but halfway through, she hesitated and stopped. What are you doing here? Anna clutched the edge of her clothes, her voice soft. I'm sorry, George. I didn't mean for things to happen like this at the wedding. But I was afraid that if I didn't leave with Henry, there would be no second chance. I watched her, standing there, her head lowered slightly. From where I stood, I could see the glistening tears hanging from her eyelashes. This scene had played out so many times in our lives. I had always fought for her smile without complaint, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness. Anna, do you really not know? What? She looked up at me, confused. Do you really not know what I've given up for you? How much pain I've endured for these 10 years? Do you really not understand? Or is it that you know too well how much I care for you and just don't want to let go? Have you been using me as a tool, calling on me when you need me and pushing me away when you don't? Anna's eyes widened in panic, and she hastily tried to defend herself. I would never think of you like that, George. You can't say that about me. Whether you would or not doesn't matter anymore. I'm tired. I'm going to rest now. I walked past Anna and reached for the door, but she grabbed my sleeve again. She seemed hesitant, but eventually, she looked up at me with those tear-filled eyes. George, could you talk to my parents? Could you tell them to accept Henry? I almost laughed at Anna's words, so much so that I couldn't help but scoff. I pulled her hand off me and crossed my arms, looking at her with contempt. Anna, is there anything in that head of yours besides that ridiculous idea of love? Why would I help you? Is it because of your few cheap tears? Or because I once loved you for 10 years? Anna looked at me in shock. It was the first time in all the years I'd known her that I spoke to her with such harsh words. But, you're my brother. Look, she is so old now, but she only uses brother to summarize the relationship between her and me. I'm sorry, my parents only had one son. I don't have a sister. I didn't bother with Anna's cries. I slammed the door shut behind me. It seemed like Anna lingered outside for a while. I even heard Henry's voice. That evening, when my parents returned, I told them I wasn't going to stay with Anna anymore, and they understood. As for Mrs. Collins, I might still be able to play the role of a dutiful son, but being a son-in-law, well, that was a role I was destined never to fulfill. The next morning, however, my mother woke me up in a hurry. What happened, Mom? Anna's gone to the hospital. Mr. Collins just woke up, but he collapsed again from the shock and is now undergoing surgery. I quickly packed up and headed to the hospital with my mom. As soon as we stepped off the elevator, I heard Mrs. Collins' angry voice. If you really like him that much, and don't care about us anymore, then go with him. You already have a child, so what do you need us for? Mom. Can't you understand me just a little? This is the person I truly love. Can't you accept him? Accept what? Accept that he's working construction and only earns a few $1,000s a month? Or accept that he swears all the time, has no manners, and no education? That's prejudice. Anna said. My mother and I rushed over and saw Mrs. Collins sitting on a bench, one hand pressed to her chest, her face streaked with tears. Anna stood in front of her, an angry expression on her face, one arm wrapped around Henry's. When Henry saw me, his indifferent gaze turned smug. I didn't spare him another glance. Instead, I knelt in front of Mrs. Collins, worriedly supporting her arm. Mrs. Collins, are you okay? Don't get too worked up. Take it easy for your health. Seeing me, Mrs. Collins' tears fell again, her hand trembling. George, sorry. Don't say that, Mrs. Collins. This isn't your fault. I asked my mom to help Mrs. Collins to the room to rest while I stayed to watch over Mr. Collins. But Anna still wasn't giving up. She called out to Mrs. Collins just as she was about to leave. Mom. If you can't accept Henry, then don't accept me as your daughter anymore. I looked up at Anna, my mind nearly exploding. Once again, she left me speechless with her nonsensical words. But she didn't seem to realize how incomprehensible her statement was. Instead, she wore a face that looked as though she was courageously sacrificing herself for love. Mrs. Collins froze, but didn't turn around. Then let it be. Let's just pretend we never raised you. That was her final statement to Anna. Anna was clearly taken aback by Mrs. Collins' response, standing frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. George. Why didn't you defend me just now? I was on the phone with my father, reporting on the situation at the hospital, when I heard Anna call my name. I didn't even look up. Even without seeing her, I knew exactly what kind of expression she had. It was one of hurt, frustration, and questioning, just like it had always been over the years. Why should I defend you? Anna, if you're so thick-headed, maybe you should see a doctor. What am I to you? The fiancé you abandoned at the wedding? Or the brother you've grown up with since childhood? I set down the phone and looked down at Anna, her face full of accusations. My tone was sharp. George, I know you're still upset about yesterday, but can't you just let me be? Henry and I truly love each other. You've seen how much I've suffered for him all these years. She turned her head and exchanged a loving glance with Henry, her eyes full of affection. I couldn't help but feel disgusted. This kind of love, built on the pain of a family, was something I couldn't understand. Enough. Who you're in love with has nothing to do with me, but you've managed to drive your own father into surgery because of this so-called love. Anna, you really are something. This is your so-called supreme love? I'm truly amazed. Anna's face turned red from what I said, and Henry reached out to put his arm around her shoulders. George, I know you look down on me, but Anna has always only loved me. You don't understand her at all. You don't know what Anna's dreams are, or what kind of life she wants. Being with you all just makes her feel suffocated and miserable. Henry tilted his chin up, looking smug. Dreams? When Anna failed the college entrance exam after high school, Mrs. Collins donated a building to a school just to get her in. During her 4 years of university, she wallowed in the pain of love and hardly studied. That she even managed to graduate was a miracle. I guessed her dream was simply to marry Henry and have children. I didn't speak. Honestly, I couldn't be bothered to argue with them. But Henry seemed to misinterpret my silence, his expression growing even more self-satisfied. I'll give Anna a good life. Anna, let's go. Watching them walk away, I started to wonder if I had protected Anna too much when we were younger. Had I shielded her so well that, at 24, she still acted like a 14-year-old? Just as naive, just as oblivious to the hardships of life. But then again, there were many 14-year-olds who were far more mature than she was. This was the path she had chosen, and no one could stop her. That night, I heard from Mrs. Collins that Anna had packed her things and left the city with Henry. Though they were heartbroken, they had finally given up on her actions and didn't try to stop her. The scandal between Anna and me became gossip in social circles for months. Every time I went out with friends, I was sure to be teased about it. To avoid such scenes, I cancelled all my social gatherings and focused on working at the company with my father. Meanwhile, Mrs. Collins seemed to have found a student to help manage part of the company's affairs. This student had no parents and, in turn, adopted Mr. and Mrs. Collins as her godparents, even changing her name. I had met her twice, and perhaps because she had suffered so much in her youth, she was nothing like Anna. She always wore a bright smile and gave everything she had to help Mrs. Collins. Though not their biological daughter, she was more considerate than Anna had ever been. Little by little, Mrs. Collins and her husband began to recover from the heartache Anna had caused. Thanks for bringing me home today, George. Selina stood before me, dressed elegantly in a long dress, a soft dimple showing as she smiled. I chuckled and shook my head. If I hadn't brought you back, Mr. Collins would have probably turned me into a specimen. She smiled even more brightly. My dad's not as dramatic as you make him out to be. George, who is she? In the dim light, Anna stepped forward with a pale face. Her stomach had noticeably grown, and her once round face was now marked with wrinkles, making her appear as though she'd aged years. Selina stood beside me, her expensive attire standing in stark contrast to Anna's disheveled appearance. Selina had seen Anna's photos before, but Anna's drastic change, combined with the low lighting, made it difficult for her to recognize her at first. George, who is this? I frowned at Anna and turned to Selina, smiling as I said, just an old friend. Go on inside, let me know when you get home. Selina was very perceptive about boundaries. She didn't pry and just nodded with a smile, saying goodbye to Anna before leaving. However, Anna didn't acknowledge her. Once Selena's figure disappeared from view, I finally turned back to Anna. The moment I saw her, irritation settled in my chest. What are you doing here? Perhaps she hadn't expected my tone to be so cold, and Anna's initial attempt to confront me quickly deflated, like a balloon losing air. She bit her lip, her eyes brimming with tears. Henry, he's been treating me badly. George, only now do I realize who's truly good to me. She reached out to grab my hand, but I pulled away. So, what? Because your life isn't going well, now you remember me, the fool? Anna's eyes widened, her lips quivering as she sharply retorted. How can you think that of me, George? I truly know I was wrong, and I'm sorry. But when I came back today, the security guard at the gate didn't even recognize me. And that woman who just got out of your car, who is she? Why is she living in this neighborhood? Why did you send her back? Anna's barrage of questions left me feeling overwhelmed. I instinctively reached for a cigarette, but then remembered I'd promised Selena I'd quit, so I held myself back. Anna, you need to understand, no one's place in this world is irreplaceable. Since you've made up your mind to cut ties with us, someone else will take your place. You're not the son, you're not that important. Anna's eyes widened, and in an instant, she realized who Selena was. She lunged at me, grabbing my shirt with both hands, her eyes red and wild. No. I don't believe it. I'm still Dad and Mom's daughter. I'm the young lady of the Collins family. Your childhood friend. George, have you forgotten me? I don't believe you'd abandon me. Just then, my phone vibrated. Selena must have gotten home. I didn't have time to engage with Anna any longer, there was plenty of work waiting for me back at home. I yanked my shirt out of Anna's grasp and stepped back without a second thought. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. I'm going home now. I've got things to do. Anna continued calling my name from behind, but I was already in the car, hitting the accelerator and leaving her in the dust. At home, sitting in front of my computer, the image of Anna from earlier still lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. I decided to call the private investigator to look into what had happened after Anna and Henry left. Before I received the report, I had assumed that Anna had just missed Mrs. Collins and wanted to visit, after reading the files, I realized I didn't know Anna nearly as well as I thought. After Henry was expelled from high school for fighting, he never went back to school. Over the years, he hadn't accomplished anything in society, which was clear proof that he was someone without ambition. As for Anna, she grew up with everything she could ever want. After graduating from college, she never worked a day at the company. Her daily routine consisted of eating out, shopping, going to the movies, and buying luxury goods and jewelry, always at my expense. It's easy to go from modest to luxurious, but going back from luxury to modesty is much harder. Anna and Henry's sweet life didn't last long. Soon, they started fighting over everyday things like food and bills, and sometimes Henry even hit Anna. Fortunately, he didn't hurt her badly, considering she was pregnant. Henry, with tears in his eyes, kneeled and apologized, vowing to achieve something for her, to restore her pride. And despite everything, Anna forgave him. But Henry's idea of restoring pride was to gamble at the casino, hoping for easy money. Not only did he lose all their savings, but he also accumulated a debt of several $100,000. That was the real reason Anna came back, she intended for US to pay off that debt. I put the files down and just then, I received a message from Mrs. Collins inviting me to dinner. It didn't take much thought to know that Anna had no way of solving her problems with me, so she went to Mrs. Collins instead. I thought for a moment and then called Selena. She picked up after a while, sounding a little tired, probably from dealing with work. George, what's up? Anna's back. Did you know? There was a brief pause in Selena's voice. I know. Do you have any thoughts on it? She let out a light laugh. She is her parents' biological daughter, what can I do? Selena was always like that, she saw Mrs. Collins and her husband as her second parents, and with that gratitude, Anna was their daughter in her eyes. If Anna wanted to come back, Selena would gladly hand everything over to her. I explained Anna's real reason for returning. Selena was silent for a moment. Selena? Don't even think about it. And she hung up the phone. Getting things done alone is far slower than when two people are working together. I knew Selena would take action, and sure enough, before the end of the day, I received a message from her. It contained proof of Henry's debt and a record of his conversation with the debt collectors, promising to repay the money by the end of the month. It seemed like Selena spent the entire afternoon gathering this information. I headed to the dinner location with the documents in hand. As soon as I walked in, I saw Anna sitting between Mr. and Mrs. Collins. She looked different from when we had met last time. She had changed her clothes, and there was a new necklace around her neck. Anna was holding her belly with one hand and, upon seeing me, her eyes lit up. "George, you're here." I sat across from Anna, and seeing me, both Mr. and Mrs. Collins smiled. If I could, I wished their smiles could last forever, but clearly, that wasn't going to happen. Mr. Collins gestured to call the waiter and place an order, but I stopped him. "No, Mr. Collins. I'm afraid you won't be able to eat this meal." He smiled and asked, "What's going on? Do you have something to say?" I looked at Anna. Her smile had frozen the moment I stopped Mr. Collins, but she still tried to maintain a calm facade. I wanted to give her one last chance. "Anna, now that you're back, don't you have anything you want to say?" Anna's hands tightened around her clothes, her lips pressed tightly together. "No." She still didn't tell the truth. I let out a long sigh. Mrs. Collins' gaze moved back and forth between Anna and me. She had already sensed something was wrong but still tried to hold on to the last sliver of hope. "Why are you two playing charades? Why don't you just tell us what's going on?" I took out my phone and laid all the evidence in front of them. Anna tried to snatch my phone, but I quickly dodged her. "She's only back to try and convince us to pay Henry's debt." Mrs. Collins trembled as she held my phone. Her hair at the temples had turned completely white, and her once delicate face now looked aged. In the months Anna wasn't around, although Mrs. Collins didn't say it, she still couldn't forget her only daughter. "Anna, is this true?" Mrs. Collins looked up at her, her murky eyes now shimmering with tears. Anna glared at me, her eyes filled with rage and resentment. Realizing she couldn't hide the truth any longer, she suddenly stood up, the screeching sound of her chair scraping across the floor piercing the silence, yet it was still less unbearable than her sharp voice. "Yes, it's true. You two are so wealthy, what's the big deal about paying Henry's debt? It's not like you can't make it back. And Henry said once the baby's born, your company will be mine. Consider it an advance." Anna spoke with such audacity that even I was shocked. I had expected her to be shameless, but I didn't realize just how shameless she could be. Mr. Collins' face turned crimson with fury, and I worried he might collapse again. I quickly went over and grabbed his arm to steady him, but thankfully, he quickly caught his breath. He patted my hand, and with my support, he stood up, looking down at Anna with an expression that was both confused and deeply disappointed, but mostly resolute. "Anna, to be fair, we've never treated you poorly over the years, but maybe that's the problem. We've been too good to you, and now you think everything we've given you is something you deserve. But in this world, there's no such thing as endless love, not even from parents. You won, Anna. We'll set you free. From now on, you're no longer our daughter. Go pursue your love, and live happily ever after with your lover." After saying this, Mr. Collins turned and walked out. Anna realized they were really going to abandon her. She immediately reached out to grab Mrs. Collins' wrist. "Mom. I'm your real daughter. You're just going to abandon me like this?" Mrs. Collins' eyes were still filled with tears, but she didn't soften at the sound of Anna calling her Mom. "Anna, the road ahead, you'll have to walk it on your own." She broke free from Anna's grasp and left. I followed closely behind, but I heard Anna calling my name from behind. "George, you won't just abandon me, will you?" I turned to look at her, raising an eyebrow. "I've said it many times. I'm the only child in my family. No sisters." As I left, I heard Anna's wailing from inside the room. I took a deep breath, forcing my trembling body to calm down. When Selina and I were leaving the venue, we saw Anna waiting anxiously outside. She was wearing clothes stained with dirt, her figure slightly bloated. The car sped past her, and Selina and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us mentioned the irrelevant stranger. Later, I ended up with Selina. She was a wonderful woman, someone who appreciated my efforts while also knowing how to reciprocate. She often told me that love could only last when it was mutual. If one person had to keep everything going, it would eventually burn out and lead to abandonment. I respected her, and I cared for her deeply. 2 days before the wedding, I accompanied Selina to the bridal shop to adjust the fit of her wedding gown. When we stepped out, I saw a woman collecting scrap on the street, and she had a child with her. The child was throwing bottles out of the bag beside her, yelling, "I want KFC. Why can't I eat it? You earn money to spend on me." When the woman turned her head, I saw a face I once knew all too well. Selina took my hand, and I supported her waist as we walked toward the car parked on the side of the road. I heard Henry was beaten to death because he couldn't pay his debts. So tragic. Yeah, it's tragic, but it's got nothing to do with us. On the wedding day, how about I give you a gift? I looked at Selena, puzzled. She smiled and gently touched her belly. I think, this would be the perfect wedding.